The sun hung low over the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, casting long shadows that stretched like lazy cats across the wooden boardwalks. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that settled in after a long day of heat and hard work, when even the saloon pianos took a breath. The only sound was the occasional creak of a swinging sign or the distant whinny of a horse tied up outside the general store. Inside the sheriff's office, the air was thick with the scent of leather, gun oil, and the faintest hint of lavender, likely from the sheriff's wife, Clara, who had a habit of leaving her mark wherever she went. Sheriff Elias Boone sat behind his desk, his broad shoulders slumped slightly as he pored over a stack of wanted posters. His badge gleamed dully in the lantern light, a symbol of order in a town that often felt one step away from chaos. The door swung open with a groan, and in walked the McAllister twins, Jake and Jesse. They were a matched pair, right down to the way they sauntered in like they owned the place. Both wore their hats low, their dusty coats flaring out behind them, and their spurs jingling just enough to announce their presence without being outright rude. Jake, the elder by a whole 2 minutes, had a scar running from his temple to his jawline, a souvenir from a bar fight in El Paso. Jesse's grin was a little crooked, the result of a horse kicking him square in the face when he was 14. It only made him look more dangerous. "Evenin', Sheriff," Jake drawled, tipping his hat just enough to be polite. "Heard you got some trouble out at the old Miller place. Thought we'd offer our services." Elias looked up, his bushy eyebrows knitting together. "Services? Last I checked, you two were wanted in 3 counties for everything from rustlin' to robbin' stagecoaches. Why in the hell would I trust you?" Jesse chuckled, leaning against the desk like it was his own. "Now, Sheriff, you wound us. We're reformed men. Ain't that right, Jake?" Jake nodded, his expression serious as a funeral. "Reformed. Swore off stealin' the moment we laid eyes on this fine town. Besides, we ain't here for money. Consider it a public service." Elias grunted, rubbing the stubble on his chin. He knew the McAllisters' reputation, but he also knew they were the best trackers within 100 miles. And right now, he had a gang of outlaws holed up in the Miller cabin, and his deputies were either too green or too scared to do anything about it. "Fine," he said finally. "But you so much as look at my wife wrong, and I'll string you both up by your toes." Jake and Jesse exchanged a glance, their grins widening. "Wouldn't dream of it, Sheriff," Jesse said, though the way his eyes flickered toward the back room where Clara was humming a tune suggested otherwise. Clara Boone was a vision, the kind of woman who made men forget their own names. She had hair the color of ripe wheat, piled high in loose curls that seemed to catch every ray of sunlight that dared to sneak through the windows. Her eyes were a sharp, knowing blue, and her laugh could make a preacher reconsider his vows. She was also, by all accounts, deeply unsatisfied with her life in Redemption Creek. Married to Elias at 18, she'd spent the last 7 years playing the part of the dutiful sheriff's wife, hosting teas, mending uniforms, and smiling sweetly at the townsfolk who whispered behind her back about how a woman like her must be wasting away in a place like this. But Clara had a fire in her, one that Elias, for all his gruff charm, had never quite managed to stoke. That evening, as the twins rode out toward the Miller place, Clara stood on the porch of the sheriff's office, watching them go. She'd heard the stories, of course, how the McAllisters had left a trail of broken hearts and empty whiskey bottles from Texas to Montana. She'd also heard how they moved, like 2 parts of the same storm, unpredictable and thrilling. The night was warm, the kind of warm that made the air feel thick enough to swim through. Clara fanned herself with a folded newspaper, her gaze lingering on the horizon long after the twins had disappeared from sight. She wasn't sure what she was hoping for. Maybe just a little excitement, a little reminder that she was still alive, still capable of feeling something other than the slow, creeping boredom that had settled over her like dust. Inside, Elias was snoring in his chair, his boots propped up on the desk, his hat tipped over his eyes. Clara rolled her eyes and stepped back inside, shutting the door softly behind her. She moved through the dimly lit room, her skirts whispering against the floorboards. The jail cells at the back were empty, the iron bars casting shadows that looked like stretched-out fingers. She paused in front of the cells, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. It was a strange thought, but she wondered what it would be like to be locked up, to have no choice but to wait, to want, to let someone else take control for once. The Miller cabin was just as the rumors had described. Half collapsed, the roof sagging like a drunkard's spine, and the smell of rot hanging heavy in the air. The outlaws inside were a ragged bunch, their faces gaunt from weeks on the run, their eyes wild with a kind of desperation that made men stupid. Jake and Jesse didn't bother with subtlety. They rode right up to the porch, their horses kicking up dust that swirled in the fading light. Jake dismounted first, his hand resting easy on the butt of his revolver. "Evenin', boys," he called, his voice carrying the kind of calm that made men nervous. "Y'all look like you could use a drink." One of the outlaws, a wiry man with a patchy beard, stepped onto the porch, his rifle held loose but ready. "We ain't lookin' for company," he spat. Jesse swung down from his saddle, stretching his arms like he didn't have a care in the world. "That's a shame. We were hopin' to share some news. See, the sheriff's off errand, a pardon to anyone who turns themselves in by sunrise. Figured you'd want to know, seein' as how you're all fixin' to die otherwise." The outlaw's grip tightened on his rifle. "You lyin'?" Jake shook his head. "Scout's honor." He held up his fingers in a mock salute. "Course, if you'd rather take your chances with us, well—" He let the sentence hang, the implication clear. The outlaws exchanged glances. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. One by one, they filed out of the cabin, their hands raised, their pride swallowed along with their last bit of hope. By the time Jake and Jesse rode back into Redemption Creek, the moon was high, and the town was asleep. The jailhouse lantern burned low, casting a golden glow that spilled out onto the street. Clara was still awake, sitting on the porch with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She looked up as they approached, her eyes reflecting the flickering light. "Well," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Aren't you two just the heroes of the hour?" Jake tipped his hat. "Ma'am." Jesse grinned. "At your service." Elias, roused by the commotion, stumbled out of the office, blinking like a man who'd been asleep for a week. "You got him?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "We got him," Jake confirmed. "All 6, trussed up like Christmas turkeys." Elias clapped Jake on the shoulder, his expression a mix of relief and grudging respect. "Good work. I'll wire the judge in the mornin'. You boys can collect your reward then." Jesse glanced at Clara, then back at Elias. "Tell you what, Sheriff. We don't need no reward. Just a place to sleep tonight. Those cells look mighty comfortable." Elias frowned. "You want to sleep in the jail?" "Why not?" Jake said, shrugging. "Ain't like we ain't been there before." Clara's laugh was soft, musical. "Oh, Elias. Let them. It's the least we can do for our saviors." Elias scratched his head, confused but too tired to argue. "Suit yourselves." He unlocked the cells with a yawn. "Just don't make a mess." The twins stepped inside, the iron door clanging shut behind them. Clara watched as Elias locked it, her smile never wavering. "Sweet dreams, boys," she called, her voice sweet as honey. Jake leaned against the bars, his grin matching hers. "Oh, I reckon they will be." The jail cell was cramped, the iron bars casting jagged shadows across the dirt floor as the lantern light flickered. Jake and Jesse didn't seem to mind. They'd slept in worse places, caves, stables, even a hayloft once, after a particularly rowdy night in Abilene. Jesse stretched out on the thin cot, his boots crossed at the ankles, while Jake leaned against the bars, his arms folded, watching Clara with an easy confidence that bordered on arrogance. Clara lingered near the cells, her fingers tracing the edge of her shawl. "You two are something else," she said, her voice low and amused. "Most men would want a hot meal and a soft bed after a night like yours. But no, you'd rather be locked up." Jesse chuckled, tipping his hat back to get a better look at her. "Darlin', we found that the most interesting things in life usually come with a few restrictions." Jake's grin was slower, more deliberate. "Besides, we figured the view would be better in here." Clara's laugh was soft, but her eyes sparkled with something sharper. Challenge, maybe, or curiosity. "Flattery won't get you anywhere, Mr. McAllister." "It usually does," Jake replied, unfazed. Elias, who had been rummaging through a drawer for the jail ledger, finally seemed to notice the way his wife and the twins were looking at each other. His expression darkened. "All right, that's enough," he said, stepping between Clara and the bars. "You boys get some rest. Clara, go on up to bed." Clara didn't move. "I'm not tired, Elias." Elias sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's late. And I got a feelin' these two are gonna be nothin' but trouble if you keep standin' there." Jesse sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the cot. "Now, Sheriff, we ain't here to cause trouble. We're just admirin' the scenery." Elias shot him a warning look. "One more word, and I'll throw away the key." Clara finally relented, though not without a parting glance at the twins. "Good night, gentlemen," she said, her voice dripping with amusement. "Try not to escape before morning." Jake touched the brim of his hat. "Wouldn't dream of it, ma'am." As Clara ascended the stairs to the living quarters above the jail, Elias turned back to the twins, his expression stern. "You two better not be plannin' nothin' stupid." Jesse held up his hands in mock surrender. "Sheriff, we're just here to help. Ain't that right, Jake?" Jake nodded, though his eyes were still fixed on the spot where Clara had disappeared. "Wouldn't have it any other way." Elias grunted, shaking his head. He grabbed the lantern and headed for the door. "I'm goin' to bed. You boys behave yourselves." The moment the door shut behind him, Jake and Jesse exchanged a look. Jesse let out a low whistle. "Well, that was easier than I thought." Jake pushed off the bars and sat on the edge of the cot beside his brother. "Easier than what?" "Gettin' locked up with the sheriff's wife eyeing us like we're the last two steaks in Texas." Jake smirked. "She's got fire, that one. And a husband who don't know what to do with it." Jesse leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head. "Reckon we could teach him a thing or two." The twins settled into the silence, the kind that only existed between two people who knew each other's thoughts before they were spoken. The night outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that made the world feel like it was holding its breath. Upstairs, Clara stood at the window, her fingers resting on the sill. The moon cast a silver glow over the town, turning the dusty streets into something almost beautiful. She could hear Elias snoring softly behind her, the rhythm steady and familiar. She should be asleep, too. But her mind was racing, her skin tingling with a restlessness she hadn't felt in years. She thought about the twins, locked up downstairs. There was something about them, something wild and untamed, that made her heart beat faster. It wasn't just their looks, though they were handsome enough, with their sharp jaws and easy grins. It was the way they moved, like they were always one step ahead of the world, like they knew secrets no one else did. Clara turned away from the window, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She moved to the dresser, where a small bottle of whiskey sat half-hidden behind a hairbrush. She poured herself a finger, the amber liquid catching the moonlight as she brought it to her lips. The burn was sharp, grounding. Downstairs, the twins were talking in low voices, their words muffled but their laughter clear. Clara found herself smiling, her fingers tightening around the glass. She knew she should leave them be. She knew this was dangerous. But for the first time in a long time, she felt alive. The night wore on, the hours slipping by like thieves. Jake and Jesse took turns keeping watch, not that there was much to watch for in a town as quiet as Redemption Creek. Around midnight, Jesse nudged his brother awake. "Your turn," he whispered. Jake sat up, rubbing his eyes. "You get any sleep?" "Enough," Jesse replied, stretching. "Besides, I got a feelin' this night ain't over yet." Jake didn't ask what he meant. He didn't have to. They'd always had a way of knowing things before they happened, like the wind shifting before a storm. Sure enough, not 10 minutes later, the door at the top of the stairs creaked open. Clara descended, her bare feet silent, her nightgown a pale shadow in the dark. She carried a tray with 2 cups of coffee and a plate of biscuits. Jake stood as she approached, his voice low. "Ma'am." Clara set the tray down on the small table outside the cells. "Thought you boys might be hungry." Jesse was already reaching for a biscuit. You're an angel, Mrs. Boone. Clara's laugh was quiet, her eyes flickering between them. Hardly. But I figured if I'm going to have guests, I ought to feed them. Jake picked up a cup of coffee, the steam curling around his fingers. Much obliged. Clara leaned against the bars, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You know, Elias sleeps like the dead. Always has. Jessie raised an eyebrow. Is that so? She nodded, a slow smile spreading across her face. He won't wake up till dawn. And even then, it takes a cannon to rouse him. Jake took a sip of coffee, his gaze never leaving hers. You tellin' us this for a reason, Mrs. Boone? Clara's smile turned playful. Maybe I am. Maybe I'm just makin' conversation. Jessie grinned. I reckon it's a mite more interestin' than talkin' about the weather. Clara reached into the pocket of her nightgown and pulled out a small key. She held it up, letting it catch the light. Ever been in a jail cell with the door unlocked? Jake's eyes gleamed. Can't say that I have. She slid the key through the bars. It landed with a soft clink on the floor inside the cell. There's a first time for everything. Jessie picked up the key, turning it over in his fingers. You're playin' with fire, darlin'. Clara's voice was steady, her gaze unflinching. I know. The twins didn't hesitate. Jake unlocked the cell door, the hinges groaning softly as it swung open. They stepped out, their movements quiet, their eyes on Clara. She didn't back away. Instead, she reached for Jake's hand, her fingers warm against his skin. Follow me, she whispered. They moved like shadows, slipping up the stairs and into the living quarters above. The room was small but tidy, the bed unmade, the air thick with the scent of lavender and something else, something electric. Elias was still asleep, his mouth slightly open, his snores rumbling like distant thunder. Clara led the twins to the far side of the room, where a narrow door opened into a small storage closet. It wasn't much, but it was private. Jessie closed the door behind them, the space suddenly feeling even smaller. Clara turned to face them, her breath coming faster now, her cheeks flushed. You two are trouble, she said, but there was no fear in her voice. Only anticipation. Jake leaned against the door, his voice a low murmur. We've been called worse. Clara reached up, her fingers tracing the scar on Jake's jaw. I don't doubt it. Jessie watched them, his grin fading into something more serious. You sure about this, darlin'? Clara met his gaze, her eyes bright in the dim light. I've never been surer of anything in my life. The night stretched on, the hours slipping by unnoticed. The twins took turns, as they did with everything, riding, gambling, even fighting. It was their way, the unspoken rule that had kept them alive and together for as long as they could remember. Clara was a revelation, passionate, bold, unafraid. She laughed when they did, her fingers tangling in their hair, her lips warm against their skin. For the first time in years, she felt free. Downstairs, the jailhouse remained quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant howl of a coyote. No one came. No one knew. Dawn came too soon, the first light of morning slipping through the cracks in the shutters. Clara dressed quickly, her movements efficient, her expression calm. The twins watched her, their own clothes slightly rumpled, their grins lazy and satisfied. You boys better get back downstairs, she said, her voice steady. Elias will be up soon. Jake nodded, but he didn't move. What happens now? Clara tied her robe, her fingers deft. Now, you wait. I'll take care of the rest. Jessie tipped his hat. We'll hold you to that, darlin'. Clara smiled, but there was a glint in her eyes, something sharp and determined. Oh, I know you will. The twins slipped back into the cell, locking the door behind them just as the floorboards above creaked with Elias's weight. Clara descended the stairs a moment later, her hair neatly pinned, her expression serene. Elias yawned, scratching his chest as he emerged from the living quarters. Mornin', darlin', he mumbled. You sleep all right? Clara poured him a cup of coffee, her movements smooth. Like a baby, she said, her voice sweet. How about you? Elias grunted, taking the cup. Like a rock. Didn't even hear those two down here. He jerked his thumb toward the cells. Clara's smile didn't waver. They were quiet as mice. Elias took a sip of coffee, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the twins. You two look like hell. Jesse stretched, feigning exhaustion. Didn't sleep much, Sheriff. Too excited about that reward. Elias snorted. Yeah, well, you'll get it. Soon as the judge wires back. He unlocked the cell door, his expression grudging. You're free to go. But I don't want to see you in my town after sundown. You hear? Jake tipped his hat. Loud and clear, Sheriff. The twins stepped out, their movements easy, their expressions innocent. Clara watched them go, her fingers tightening around her own cup of coffee. Elias didn't notice. He was too busy grumbling about paperwork. The twins sauntered out of the jailhouse, the morning sun casting long shadows behind them. Jake adjusted his hat, his eyes lingering on Clara for a moment before he turned toward the stables. Jesse paused on the boardwalk, tipping his hat to her with a wink. Ma'am, he drawled, his voice carrying just enough to make Elias scowl. Clara stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Ride safe, boys, she called, her voice sweet as syrup but with an edge that only they could hear. Elias watched them go, his hands on his hips. Good riddance, he muttered, though there was no real venom in it. He turned back to Clara, his expression softening. You all right, darlin'? You look like you got something on your mind. Clara stepped back inside, her skirts swishing around her ankles. Just thinking about how quiet it's gonna be without those two stirring up trouble. Elias chuckled, shaking his head. Quiet's good. Means I can finally get some work done. He moved to his desk, shuffling through the stack of papers that had been waiting for him. You headin' to the general store today? We're runnin' low on coffee. Clara hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. Actually, Elias, I was thinkin' I might ride out to the old Miller place. Make sure those outlaws didn't leave anything behind that could cause trouble. Elias looked up, frowning. You ain't goin' out there alone. It ain't safe. Clara raised an eyebrow. Since when do I need a chaperone? I can handle myself. Elias sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I know you can. But humor me, all right? Take one of the deputies with you. Clara's smile was slow, knowing. Fine. But only if you promise to keep an eye on those wanted posters. Wouldn't want any more surprises walkin' through that door. Elias grunted, already turning back to his work. Deal. The Miller place was just as they'd left it, abandoned, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and old smoke. Clara rode up slowly, her horse picking its way through the overgrown brush. She dismounted, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth as she stepped onto the sagging porch. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the cabin was a mess, overturned chairs, broken bottles, and the remnants of a fire that had long since burned out. Clara moved through the space, her fingers trailing over the dusty surfaces. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Maybe nothing. Maybe just a moment to herself, away from the watchful eyes of Redemption Creek. She found it in the back room, a small, half-collapsed cot, the blankets still rumpled from the outlaw's stay. Clara sat down, her skirts pooling around her, and pulled a small, worn deck of cards from her pocket. She'd taken them from the twins' saddlebags that morning, a silent keepsake of the night before. She shuffled the deck, the cards whispering against each other, and began to lay out a game of solitaire. The rhythm of it was soothing, the familiar slide of the cards a comfort. She was so absorbed that she didn't hear the hoofbeats until they were almost on top of her. Clara looked up, her hand freezing mid-motion. Jake and Jesse stood in the doorway, their hats tipped back, their expressions unreadable. Ma'am, Jake said, his voice low. Clara didn't startle. She didn't scream. She just set the cards down and stood, brushing the dust from her skirts. You two have a habit of showing up where you ain't wanted, Jesse grinned, stepping inside. Now, darlin', we're exactly where we want to be. Jake's gaze was more serious, his eyes searching hers. We couldn't ride out without saying goodbye proper. Clara crossed her arms, her chin lifting slightly. Goodbye's already been said. Jesse moved closer, his voice dropping to a murmur. Not like this. Clara's breath hitched, but she didn't back away. You're playing a dangerous game, Jesse McAllister. Jake stepped up beside his brother, his presence solid, reassuring. We've always liked danger. Clara looked between them, her resolve wavering. She knew this was reckless. She knew Elias would lose his mind if he found out. But for the first time in years, she didn't care. She reached out, her fingers brushing against Jake's chest. You're both fools. Jesse caught her hand, his grin turning wicked. And you love it. The ride back to Redemption Creek was slow, the twins flanking Clara like guardians. They didn't speak much, the silence between them comfortable, charged with something unspoken. The town came into view as the sun began its descent, the buildings casting long shadows across the dusty streets. Clara pulled her horse to a stop just outside of town, turning to face the twins. This is where we part ways. Jake's expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady. You sure about that? Clara nodded, her fingers tightening on the reins. Elias's already suspicious. If he sees us ridin' in together, he'll know something's up. Jesse tipped his hat, his grin softening. All right, darlin'. But this ain't the last you'll see of us. Clara smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in it. I reckon it ain't. The twins rode off, their figures growing smaller as they disappeared into the horizon. Clara watched them go, her heart heavy but her mind made up. She turned her horse toward town, her back straight, her expression calm. Elias was waiting for her when she rode up to the jailhouse. His arms were crossed, his expression stormy. Where the hell have you been? Clara dismounted, her movements slow, deliberate. I told you I was riding out to the Miller place. Elias's jaw tightened. For half the damn day? Clara, I ain't stupid. I know something's going on. Clara met his gaze, her voice steady. Nothing's going on, Elias. I was checking the place, making sure it was safe. That's all. Elias stepped closer, his voice dropping. You're lying to me. Clara didn't flinch. I ain't lying. But even if I was, what are you gonna do about it? Elias's expression darkened. I'm the sheriff, Clara. I can't have my wife running around with outlaws. Clara's laugh was sharp, unexpected. Outlaws? Those boys saved your hide, Elias. And you locked them up for it. Elias's face flushed. They're dangerous. So am I, Clara shot back. But you don't see me locked in a cell. Elias stared at her, his hands clenching into fists. For a moment, Clara thought he might explode. But then, slowly, his expression changed. The anger drained out of him, replaced by something else, resignation, maybe, or even understanding. You're right, he said finally, his voice tired. I ain't been the husband you deserve, Clara. I know that. Clara's anger faltered, her voice softening. Elias. He held up a hand, cutting her off. No, let me finish. I ain't blind. I see the way you look at me sometimes, like you're wondering what the hell you're doing here. And I ain't got an answer for you. But I do know this, I ain't letting you go. Not to them, not to anyone. Clara's throat tightened. I ain't a skin you two. Elias reached out, his hand brushing against hers. Then what are you a skin for? Clara looked down, her fingers tangling with his. I don't know, she admitted quietly. Maybe just a little less quiet. Elias was silent for a long moment. Then, to Clara's surprise, he laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that filled the space between them. All right, darlin'. I reckon I can manage that. That evening, The jailhouse was alive with noise, laughter, the clink of glasses, the occasional burst of song. Elias had invited half the town over, claiming it was to celebrate the capture of the outlaws. But Clara knew better. This was his way of making things right, of filling the silence that had settled between them for too long. She stood near the door, a glass of whiskey in her hand, watching as Elias regaled a group of deputies with one of his tall tales. He was in his element, his voice booming, his laughter infectious. Clara smiled, though her mind was elsewhere. The door swung open, and the room fell silent. Jake and Jesse stood in the doorway, their hats in their hands, their expressions cautious. Every eye in the room turned to them, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Elias's face darkened. "What the hell are you two doing here?" Jake stepped forward, his voice calm. "We heard there was a celebration. Thought we'd join in." Jesse's grin was easy, though his eyes were sharp. "Besides, Sheriff, we ain't done nothin' wrong. Least, not that you can prove." Elias's hands clenched, but Clara stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "They're right, Elias. They helped us. The least we can do is offer 'em a drink." Elias looked at her, his expression conflicted. But then, slowly, he nodded. "Fine. But one wrong move, and you're both back in that cell." The twins moved into the room, the crowd parting for them like water around a rock. Clara watched as they made their way to the bar, their movements easy, their presence commanding. She felt a thrill run through her, something wild and untamed. Elias sidled up beside her, his voice low. "You're playin' with fire, Clara." Clara took a sip of her whiskey, her gaze never leaving the twins. "Maybe," she said softly, "but I ain't afraid to burn." The night wore on, the whiskey flowing, the laughter growing louder. At some point, Clara found herself cornered by the twins near the back of the room. Jake leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Jesse grinned, his eyes bright with mischief. "You two are something else," Clara said, her voice low. Jesse tipped his hat. "We try, ma'am." Jake's gaze was more intense, his voice serious. "You all right?" Clara met his eyes, her smile slow. "I'm better than all right." Elias appeared beside them, his expression stern. "All right, that's enough. You boys have had your fun. Time to go." Jesse sighed dramatically. "Sheriff, you're killin' the party." Elias didn't budge. "Out. Now." The twins didn't argue. They tipped their hats to Clara, their grins lingering. "Till next time, darlin'," Jesse said. Jake's gaze was softer, his voice quiet. "Take care of yourself, Clara." She watched them go, her heart heavy but her spirit lighter than it had been in years. Elias moved to stand beside her, his voice gruff. "You happy now?" Clara leaned into him, her voice teasing. "Almost." Elias sighed, shaking his head. But there was a smile in his voice as he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "You're gonna be the death of me, woman." Clara laughed, the sound bright and free. "Maybe. But what a way to go." The next morning, the twins were gone, their horses' tracks leading out of town and into the endless expanse of the Wild West. Redemption Creek returned to its usual quiet, the dust settling, the sun beating down. But for Clara, everything had changed. She stood on the porch of the jailhouse, a cup of coffee in her hand, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Somewhere out there, the twins were riding, free and untamed. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel trapped. Elias stepped up beside her, his voice quiet. "You miss em." Clara took a sip of coffee, her smile slow. "Maybe a little." Elias chuckled, shaking his head. "You're something else, Clara Boone." She leaned into him, her voice soft. "So are you, Elias. Even if you don't know it yet." And with that, she turned back inside, leaving the sheriff to stare after her, his heart full, his mind racing, and his life suddenly a whole lot more interesting.